Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always excited to explore new ideas.
Well, today's topic is pretty crucial, wouldn't you say? We're diving into the state of democracy.
Couldn't be more relevant, right? Especially these days.
Yeah, and we're going to be focusing on the US, but looking at it in a global context, too.
Sounds fascinating.
And to guide our deep dive, we've got this report called Democracy Playbook 2025.
Okay, I've heard of this. It's like a guide for pro-democracy folks, right?
Yeah, exactly. Meant to help strengthen democratic institutions and practices worldwide.
What's the angle? What's the playbook's main focus?
Well, what I found really interesting is this idea of a competition. It talks about this competition between democratic and what they call illiberal forces.
Illiberal. Almost like a tug of war, between different ideologies, different ways of governing.
Yeah, exactly. And they make it clear that the stakes are high. They even use this term democratic backsliding.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term. It's basically the idea that democracies are kind of eroding, right?
Right, and get this. They say the rule of law in the U.S. is facing a level of threat unlike anything in recent history.
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. Are they talking about specific threats?
Well, they connect it to this broader trend of authoritarianism rising globally.
Yeah, we've seen that in places like Hungary, China, Russia.
Exactly. Countries where leaders are actively, chipping away at democratic institutions. It's almost like, well, it's unsettling to think about.
Definitely unsettling. So what does the playbook suggest we do about it? If things are really this bad, how do we even begin to counter these trends?
That's where it gets really interesting. They actually highlight this chillingly vivid example, the January 6th Capitol attack.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was a pretty stark image of, the fragility of democracy.
And they call it a profoundly concerning example of political violence that directly threatens U.S. democracy.
And it's not just political violence, right? Even institutions like the judiciary are under pressure.
Right. And you know who highlighted this? Chief Justice John Roberts in his 2024 report. He pointed to threats like violence, intimidation, disinformation campaigns, all these tactics that really chip away at public trust in institutions.
It's almost like an attack on multiple fronts, isn't it? So if democracy is this fragile, how do we even begin to defend it? What does the playbook say?
Well, that's where they get really practical. They lay out 7 pillars for, well, strengthening democracy. Think of them as the essential supports for a healthy system.
7 pillars, okay. I'm curious, what are they?
Well, the first one is pretty straightforward: protecting elections, ensuring they're free, fair, and accessible to all.
Makes sense. It's like Democracy 101, right?
Yeah, and then there's defending the rule of law,
Yeah.
safeguarding institutions like courts and legislatures from, undue influence, making sure they function fairly.
Right. Those are the bedrock institutions. Got to keep them strong.
Absolutely. And of course, there's fighting corruption, promoting transparency, ethics, and accountability in government.
Essential. Can't have a healthy democracy without that.
Right. And then it gets even broader. The playbook also talks about reinforcing what they call civic and media space.
What does that mean exactly?
It means supporting a vibrant civil society, where people can freely assemble and express their views, and fostering an independent media that can hold power accountable.
So it's not just about elections and institutions. It's about creating a culture where democratic values can thrive. Makes sense.
But wouldn't government funding for media risk influencing those outlets? How could we ensure such support doesn't compromise their independence?
Right. That's the tricky part. And the playbook acknowledges that. They even suggest exploring alternative avenues like maybe support through private foundations. That could potentially reduce the risk of political influence.
That's interesting. Okay, what else do they suggest?
Well, they also emphasize the need to support pro-democracy actors,
Meaning?
empowering individuals and groups who are actively working to strengthen democracy, whether they're activists or journalists or just everyday citizens taking action in their communities.
Got it. So it's about empowering people on the ground. What about the last 2 pillars?
Okay, so the 6th one focuses on countering disinformation.
Yeah, that's a big one these days.
Huge. We're talking about combating the spread of false and misleading information, especially online. The kind of stuff that can really erode trust and undermine democratic processes.
And how do they suggest we do that? I mean, it feels like a constant battle against a fire hose of information.
It is. It is. One tactic they highlight is deterrence by denial. It's basically about building strong defenses against disinformation campaigns.
So, like, preventing the spread before it even starts?
Exactly. Fortifying your defenses so that disinformation doesn't gain a foothold in the first place.
Okay, so that's about being proactive. But what about after the fact? What if disinformation is already spreading?
Well, they also talk about deterrence by punishment.
Which is?
Basically, retaliatory measures against those who engage in disinformation campaigns, particularly foreign actors.
So, a bit of a stick to go with the carrot. Got it. And the final pillar, the seventh one.
That's what they call making democracy deliver.
Intriguing.
It's about addressing the root causes of democratic discontent, things like economic inequality and lack of opportunity.
So if people feel like democracy isn't working for them.
Exactly. They're more susceptible to the allure of authoritarianism. The playbook argues that we have to make sure democracy actually delivers tangible benefits for people.
That's a really important point. It's not just about protecting these abstract institutions, it's about making sure they're actually serving the people.
Right on. And, within each of these pillars, they dive into some really interesting tactics. They highlight automatic voter registration as a key way to boost participation.
Yeah. It's not just some far-off idea. It's already working in 24 states in D.C.
Right. It's about making it easier for people to vote.
What else? What other tactics did they suggest?
They also talk about ways to deter election interference.
Okay, yeah, we touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, the deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment.
Right, those two sides of the coin.
Exactly. You have the proactive defense and then the reactive response if someone tries to mess with our elections.
It's like a geopolitical chess game, isn't it?
It is. Always trying to stay one step ahead.
Yeah.
And then there's the playbook's focus on supporting independent media.
Right, they suggest increasing government resources for that.
Yeah, they even suggest potentially using private foundations to minimize the risk of political influence.
But wouldn't that raise concerns about those media outlets becoming beholden to those foundations? How can we make sure that support doesn't influence their reporting?
That's a valid concern. And the playbook does address that. They acknowledge that any form of support, whether from the government or private entities, needs to be carefully structured to protect editorial independence.
So it's a balancing act.
Absolutely. Transparency, clear guidelines, accountability mechanisms, all those things are crucial to make sure that funding doesn't equal influence.
Got it. So what about this idea of civil resistance? I know the playbook talks about that too.
Yeah, they actually devote a whole section to it. They argue that citizens have a vital role to play in shaping democracy beyond just voting.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about showing up at the polls every few years.
Nope, it's about actively participating, making your voice heard, holding those in power accountable. They point to movements like Black Lives Matter here in the U.S. and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
Powerful examples of people power.
Exactly. Shows how collective action can bring about real change. And speaking of shaping democracy, the playbook also talks about the role of businesses.
Oh, yeah, they do. Businesses and tech companies, right?
It's not just on individuals. Businesses have a responsibility, too.
So what are they suggesting? What should businesses be doing?
They emphasize corporate social responsibility initiatives where businesses use their influence and resources to promote democratic values.
But isn't there a risk there? That businesses driven by profit might put their bottom line ahead of democratic principles.
There's definitely a risk. They even cite McKinsey as an example of a company aligning with authoritarian regimes.
That's a little worrying.
Yeah, it raises concerns. But there's also this growing awareness among consumers, right?
Ethical business practices.
Exactly. And that could incentivize businesses to support democracy, even if it impacts their profits.
Interesting. So doing the right thing could also be good for business.
It's possible. Consumers are becoming more discerning about where they spend their money, and the playbook kind of hints at this shift. It suggests that businesses that align themselves with democratic values might actually have a competitive advantage.
Fascinating. Okay, so what about the tech companies? That seems like a whole other can of worms.
It is. It is. The relationship between tech and democracy is incredibly complex. The playbook talks about the obvious challenges like disinformation and online censorship.
Right, those are huge.
But they also get into the issue of regulation. How do we protect free speech while also preventing the spread of harmful content? It's a tough balance to strike.
Definitely. And speaking of tech and democracy, we can't ignore Elon Musk and Twitter.
Right. That's been a real-world case study in how social media can both amplify disinformation and be influenced by governments.
The playbook even mentions instances in India, Turkey, and Brazil where Twitter restricted content at the request of those governments.
Yeah, it raises questions about who controls the flow of information online. Is it the tech companies themselves, Or are they becoming more beholden to governments? Or is it even more complicated than that?
Feels like we're still figuring out the rules of the game in the digital space.
Absolutely.
Oh,
And that's part of the challenge, right? The need to adapt our thinking as technology keeps evolving and reshaping how democracy works.
okay, so we've got these 7 pillars and all these different tactics for protecting elections, countering disinformation, supporting independent media, engaging citizens. It's a lot. Where do we even start? What's the first step?
Well, amidst all these complex strategies, the playbook brings it back to the individual citizen.
Back to the individual.
They emphasize that even our everyday choices, beyond just voting, have an impact on democracy.
Oh, I like that. It makes it feel less overwhelming, like we all have a role to play.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that leads to their concluding point, which is both a challenge and a source of hope.
Okay, hit me with it. What's that final thought?
They remind us that democracies are more likely to thrive when they're supported by broad coalitions. It's not just about a few dedicated activists or politicians. It's about a critical mass of citizens actively engaged in shaping and defending their democracy.
Okay, so it's about collective action, a shared responsibility. But how do we put that into practice? The playbook doesn't exactly give us a step-by-step guide. What are we supposed to do with all this information?
And that's the challenge, isn't it? It's not about a checklist, it's about a shift in mindset. They argue that strengthening democracy requires more than just awareness. It demands action. And that action starts with each of us asking ourselves a crucial question.
All right, lay it on me. What's the question?
It's pretty straightforward but powerful, the playbook asks. If democracies are more likely to thrive when supported by broad coalitions, what role do you feel you could play in strengthening democratic principles, either in your community or beyond?
That's a big one. It's not just about voting or donating to a cause. It's about how we live our lives, how we engage with our communities, how we hold those in power accountable.
It is. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers. We're active participants in shaping the future of democracy.
I love that. It feels empowering, right? Like we all have a part to play, even if it seems small.
Exactly. And that's where the hope lies. Amidst all the challenges, we still have agency. We have the power to choose how we participate, how we resist, and how we contribute to building a more just and equitable society.
You know, it's easy to get discouraged when you see all the problems facing democracy, things like political violence, the rise of authoritarianism. But this playbook, it kind of reminds us that the future is still up for grabs.
It is. It's not about blind optimism. It's about informed action. And that starts with understanding the forces at play, the tactics, the challenges, the principles worth fighting for. That's what we've been exploring in this deep dive.
Absolutely. So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. What role will you play in shaping the future of democracy? Keep learning, stay engaged, and remember, your voice matters. Until next time, keep diving.